and do it all here. Thank you for that little introduction. And as you've already heard, my name is Esther Tsimowitz-Janik. I grew up here in Brooklyn, the proud youngest daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. I'm here tonight to share the survival story of my father, Mark Tsimowitz, alav hashalom. His yard site begins tonight, and this is the perfect way to remember him, so thank you for listening. His story is titled, Keep Your Head Up. Mark Tsimowitz was born Avram Mordcha on August 7, 1925. And that's my dad. Mark was the baby of his family and was doted on by his parents, Esther and Yaakov, and his much older siblings, sister Tselina and brother Yitzchak. The Tsimowitz family lived a happy middle-class life in Malava, Poland, a large town in north-central Poland. They were part of a thriving Jewish community of around 7,000 Jews. Selena, his sister, attended a co-ed bilingual Jewish high school called a gymnasium, where both Polish and Hebrew were spoken. And here we have a picture of the students and teachers of the Jewish high school in Malava called the gymnasium. And this is a panorama of Malava before the war, before 1939. And Mark attended a public school for his secular education and a Jewish Talmud Torah for his religious education. The family spoke both Yiddish and Polish in their home. His dad Yaakov managed a sawmill, and his mom Esther was a school teacher at the Jewish school before Mark was born. Mark had a happy childhood, and the Tsimowitz family had many Jewish and Polish friends in the town. The Jews of Malava were actively involved in the greater community, some of them even serving on the city council. As Mark entered his teenage years, the world around him started changing. In the late 1930s, the Nazis had come to power in Germany, and Jews across Europe started feeling the pain of anti-Semitism. In Mark's hometown of Malava, Jews were no longer allowed to buy homes or property, and guards were positioned near the Jewish shops to prevent the Christian customers from shopping. Jewish kids were regularly being bullied and beaten on the way to school, and they felt it safer to travel in groups. As a young teenager, Mark didn't pay much attention to the economic and political reach of the Nazis, but by the summer of 1939, he could no longer ignore the world around him. Polish army troops started arriving in Malava because it was very close to the German border. And in September 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, Malava was one of the first towns to be attacked. Despite Mark's pleading, his oldest brother Yitzchak joined the Polish army to defend their city. With the city under attack, Esther and Yaakov sent 14-year-old Mark on his way alone by horse and buggy to a cousin who lived in a safer town. After a scary trip marked by sounds of bombs and artillery fire along the way, Mark arrived safely at his cousin's. About 3 weeks passed and the fighting subsided in Malava, so Mark returned home, only to find the city in ruins and his house completely destroyed. Miraculously, his parents had survived and were staying at his Aunt Hannah's house. Toward the end of 1940, the Jewish community heard rumors that Jews would be expelled from Malava. In anticipation, Mark's parents stored some of their valuables with their Polish neighbors for safekeeping. Jewish leaders bribed the local Germans to prevent deportation, but that didn't work. At dawn on December 6, 1940, hundreds of German policemen arrived in Malava and raided every Jewish house, giving the residents only 5 minutes to evacuate. The soldiers barked orders at the Jews and beat them and herded them into the yard of the gymnasium. The Germans sorted through the rounded up Jews and selected about 3,000 of the 5,500 Jews to be loaded into cattle cars bounded for Midgerik Podlaski, about 160 miles away. Mark and his parents were among those selected. With a little food, some money, and small valuables that they could carry in their pockets, Mark and his parents boarded the cattle car for what seemed to him like a one-week journey. The Germans provided very little food or water to the Jews crammed into the cattle cars. When Mark and his parents arrived at Midgerik, they found a guide willing to sneak Mark and some others back to his hometown. After giving the guide most of their money, Esther and Yitzchak said goodbye to their son, not knowing if they would ever see each other again. The trek back to Malava in late December of 1940 was cold and dangerous. Mark had to battle the elements and the threat of the Nazis. He crossed frozen rivers and waded through waist-high snow, avoiding Nazi soldiers and somehow arriving back home in Malava. His Aunt Hannah had paid off some people so her family could remain in town, once again took Mark in to live with her family. When Mark went to get his family's valuables from his parents' Polish friends, they refused and threatened to report him to the Nazis. Within months of Mark's return, the Jews of Malava were forced to move into an enclosed area within the city called the Jewish ghetto. Conditions were difficult. Jews were forced to wear yellow scars on their clothes. There was very little food, and multiple families lived in small houses with 6 to 8 people sharing one room. And here we have a picture of where the ghetto was located in Malava, that highlighted, you can see a pink area. So you can see how small it was in relationship to the rest of the city. All the Jews were crammed into that one few block area. And then that's an actual picture of the wall of the Malava ghetto. Jews were forced to work outside of the ghetto for the Germans and the Poles, and they were not paid. Mark found a paying job in the ghetto of resoling worn-out leather shoes with handmade wood soles. And when the Germans found out he was avoiding the forced labor duty, they arrested him. In jail, Mark suffered regular beatings and was made to do heavy labor. Aunt Hannah was caught sneaking food to Mark, and she too was beaten. When Mark got out of jail, he was supposed to work for the local Germans, but he paid someone else a portion of his meager salary to go to work in his place and resumed his job resoling shoes. By the spring of 1941, Germans forced the Jews from neighboring villages into the Malava ghetto, raising the number of Jews from around 3,000 to 5,000 people. The crowding in the ghetto was overwhelming, and people were forced to find accommodations wherever available, like barns, basements, granaries, pigsties. In addition to the horrendous living conditions, the same food rations were now spread amongst more people, and many Jews starved to death. Rumors began to circulate about Nazis conducting mass killings of Jews. There was a sense of terror in the ghetto. Their leaders were being hanged for no reason. Jews were no longer allowed to leave the ghetto, even for work duties. And then, in November of 1942, the deportations began. Mark was 17 years old. In the first deportation from Malava on November 10, 1942, the elderly and sick were sent out by the Nazis for supposed resettlement, but were actually sent to the death camp of Treblinka. Mark was selected for the second deportation to what he was told was a camp. He had no idea what that meant. Alone, herded into a train car like a cattle with no food other than some scraps that he'd saved in his pockets and a little bit of water, Mark was hungry, exhausted, disoriented, and the cattle car was so crowded that everyone was forced to stand for the entire trip, which felt like a week. Their destination was Auschwitz. When Mark arrived at Auschwitz, the Germans separated the crowd of new arrivals into groups based on their fitness. They were stripped of all their clothes, their belongings, and hidden valuables. Mark was sent to shower and then tattooed with the numbers 76681 on his forearm. And you can see here in the pictures, these would be the cattle cars that would have taken them into Auschwitz, and my father's number is on his arm. Those deemed unfit were sent directly to perish in the Auschwitz gas chambers. Mark knew he was lucky because not only had he avoided the gas chamber, but he and around 500 of the strongest young men were chosen as students to be taught bricklaying. Auschwitz concentration camp was expanding daily to accommodate more prisoners, and they used prisoners to build new buildings and roads. The Maurerschule, or Bricklayer School, was located in Block 7A in Auschwitz I camp. The prisoner students slept in the barracks on the main 2 floors and attended their classes in the attic above. And here we have a picture of Auschwitz, and you see the men lined up. That was something that they did every morning and every evening. You see the barracks, that was the street where they lined up in front of all the barracks, the inside of the barracks, and that actual picture of an attic is actually where my father learned his trade of bricklaying. They were taught the trade of hands-on bricklaying, but also took classes in German language, building construction, calculation, and geometry. This education served Mark well later in life when he emigrated to the United States, but I'll talk about that later. The first few months in the camp were the hardest for Mark. Working as a bricklayer in Auschwitz was grueling. The day started at 5 a.m. with a piece of bread, some imitation coffee, and washing up before morning lineup, where prisoners were often beaten by the Nazi SS soldiers. Mark worked until sundown with a short afternoon break for some soup and water, and if he was lucky, maybe an onion. After work, another lineup with more beatings. To survive, Mark adjusted to his new life. For Mark, the conditions in his labor camp were actually a little better than the ghetto where many people just starved to death. Although they were crowded in the barracks and regularly beaten, the laborers in Auschwitz were fed to keep them strong and sturdy for the hard labor. Their direct instructor was a relatively kind man, at least kinder than the rest of the SS officers, but at any time, the laborers could be beaten, tortured, or overworked. Mark tells the story of a particularly brutal lineup, and unfortunately, you will not be able to hear him speak. Let me see. I don't know if it's going to be loud enough. Anyway, I will try and describe it. He talks about in this video clip, about a full day of bricklaying in the middle of winter, and they return to their barracks and they're forced to strip down, keeping only their belt and shoes. They're completely naked. It's the middle of winter, it's freezing. They open all the windows in the barracks. They open all the windows in the barracks, and they are forced to sleep naked all night in the freezing winter with the windows open. And even the blankets were taken for delousing. Every 2 weeks, they would take all their blankets and all their clothes for delousing, and they were taken to the laundry. They spent all night shivering, and at 5 a.m., they were marched over to the bathhouse completely naked to take cold showers with no towels, and had to march back in formation, wet and naked in the freezing cold. And he says in his words, after that day, a lot of people went missing. He said, friends he saw today, the next day, they were gone. They just didn't survive that. In 1943, Mark punched a German prisoner for calling him a dirty Jew. The barrack leader warned Mark that the prisoner he hit was going to make a complaint against him, which would likely get him sent to the gas chamber. So to save Mark, the barrack leader had him transferred with some laborers to a nearby coal mining town, Yanina, to build more houses. Mark and his friends used their smarts and charm to steal and trade for extra food. When large packages of clean clothes arrived from Auschwitz to Yanina, Mark would skim a few clothing items from those packages and trade them to the kitchen staff for food, and then he shared that with his friends. So Mark eventually returned to the labor camp at Auschwitz, where he managed to survive until the Soviet army started pushing into Poland. And by January 1945, their arrival at Auschwitz was imminent. Many of the Nazi guards and soldiers left the camp for a few hours. And although Mark probably had the chance to escape them, and some prisoners actually did escape, most were too brainwashed and too physically and emotionally battered and afraid to leave.
All we see is picture. We see
What do we see?
superheroes.
Oh,
Superheroes.
this is a screensaver? Okay. I only see the screensaver, I don't know what you're saying. We don't need pictures right now anyway.
He was a superhero.
Well, with the Soviet advancement into Poland, the Germans knew that Auschwitz and the other camps were very vulnerable, and rather than surrender their prisoners, the Nazis evacuated the labor camps, marching their prisoners further toward the interior of German territory. And on the bitter, cold winter day of January 17, 1945, Mark was one of nearly 60,000 prisoners lined up and forced to march out of Auschwitz to a camp called Gleiwitz, 30 miles away. This was just the beginning of what was called the Death March, which for Mark would span over 500 miles, and Mark was 20 years old. So imagine being in the middle of a brutal, snowy Polish winter. Mark and the other prisoners were wearing just their uniforms, which were not particularly thick or warm. Light jackets and regular shoes, not boots. From Gleiwitz to Gross Rosen, the prisoners were initially herded onto a train, but soon after hearing some shooting, the train stopped, and the Nazis kicked all the prisoners off the train and forced them to continue their journey on foot. Around 3,200 prisoners began the 160-mile march, 1-mile march to Gross Rosen. The trek would be difficult for anyone in the freezing cold, but these prisoners were weak and they were malnourished, with little protection from the elements. Along the route, Nazi guards shot any prisoners that fell behind, tried to escape. Many other prisoners simply died of exposure or exhaustion. Mark kept his head up and tried to look alert. He feared that if the guards thought he was tired, they would shoot him too. Gross Rosen was overcrowded with no place to sleep and barely any food. The camp was surrounded by a scary electrified fence, and any prisoner who tried to escape at night was killed. Mark spent 10 days at Gross Rosen, only to be marched on to yet another concentration camp called Flossenburg, more than 200 miles away. This march took about 4 weeks. Flossenburg was crowded with over 40,000 prisoners from many different camps, forcing 4 men to share a single small bunk. While dozens of prisoners died every day, others reduced to skin and bones, Mark survived by keeping his head up and working all day, clearing the accumulated snow and performing other outdoor labor. After 6 weeks at Flossenburg, Mark and other prisoners were taken to the Hocking labor camp in Bavaria, Germany, some 115 miles away. They traveled by train and by foot, marching endlessly with little or no food. Mark pushed on as many of the prisoners died along the route. One night, the prisoners took shelter in a barn. In the morning, Mark awoke to find over 30 of the prisoners around him had died. Mark was determined to survive, and he was not alone. Accompanied by a friend and fellow prisoner, Moshe Alter, Mark found strength in their camaraderie. When they were reaching the end of the journey to Hocking, Moshe told Mark that he could not walk any further and was giving up. Mark refused to leave his friend and instead hoisted Moshe onto his own 5'3" skeletal frame and dragged Moshe for several kilometers, giving Moshe enough rest to get some of his strength back and ultimately carry on. In March of 1945, the prisoners reached the Hocking concentration camp. Of the 1,500 prisoners who had left Flossenburg, Mark was one of only a few hundred that survived. When the prisoners arrived at Hocking, they were immediately put to work repairing and maintaining an airfield. The weather was getting warmer, but there was little food still. Mark survived by picking a wild edible grass called sorrel and adding it to warm water to make a kind of soup. Mark and the other prisoners sensed that the end of the war was near. They survived holding on to that hope. So somehow Mark survived for almost 6 years without falling ill at all. And then, while at poking, he found pus oozing from his ear. Mark was terrified as he remembered that an aunt of his had died of something similar when he was a child. Just as he began to lose hope, in the first week of May 1945, the Americans showed up at Poking, liberating Mark and the other prisoners. They brought with them doctors, nurses, food, and medicine. Mark was hospitalized for 6 weeks and then returned to the main camp in Poking, which had been converted into a displaced persons camp, a DP camp. And here we have pictures of Mark at the DP camp in uniform at a ceremony. And you see him there highlighted in red where he is in the middle of a Hanukkah party, actually, at DP camp. The DP camp was where more than 7,000 people, mostly Jewish survivors, were given a temporary place to stay until they can arrange their transport to a new home, either in Israel or in the United States. Like all survivors, Mark desperately searched for surviving family members. It would take a long time for Mark to learn of his immediate family's fate. They were all gone. His mother Esther died in Mizerich. His father Yaakov had tried to make it back to Malava, but died in the Warsaw Ghetto. His siblings Yitzchak and Selena had likely been killed in Bialystok. But Mark survived, and he was ready to start his life. He was an enterprising 21-year-old, and after 6 months in Poking, Mark found an apartment right outside the camp and started a business buying small appliances and necessities from the Germans and selling them to the survivors who were preparing to immigrate to Israel. In 1948, Mark sold his business and moved to Fürth, a town near Nuremberg. He opened a hardware store and continued to live in Fürth until 1955. Mark had connected with an aunt in New York and moved to the United States, arriving in New York on March 24, 1955. At 29 years old, Mark started a new life in New York with the skills of a trained bricklayer, a trade that he learned in Auschwitz. Mark joined the Bricklayers Union. Ever reaching for more, he attempted to study engineering in night school, but the language barrier was too difficult, and he shifted his studies to blueprinting and estimating at the Pratt Institute in Manhattan. With his degree in hand, Mark and a partner started a construction company. The bricklayer who learned his trade as a prisoner and a forced laborer in Auschwitz took that skill and built many buildings and brownstones still standing today in Manhattan and Brooklyn. He was a successful contractor, but in the spring of 1968, at the age of 43, Mark was still single and living in Brooklyn. While visiting a friend, he was introduced to a woman named Shoshana, 11 years younger than him. Shoshana was beautiful, smart, divorced, and also originally from Poland, with a survivor story of her own. It was love at first sight, and they were married 3 months later. Mark adopted Shoshana's children, Ruth and Marty, and 1 year later, on the day before Mark's 44th birthday, in August of 1969, Esther Lehner was born. That's me. When someone asked my mom why she couldn't wait one more day so that my dad and I would share the same birthday, she said she needed time to wrap the gift. My father and I celebrated 49 birthdays together. And you can see, this is my family first. This is the family that he created with love. My sister is in the center of the picture. My mom is on her side. My dad is on the other side. It's me in the middle, my brother at the top. And there's a picture of Mark with his grandchildren, his children and grandchildren. My father and I celebrated 49 birthdays together. He lived to be 93 years old. And despite the horrors of his youth, Mark survived to help raise 3 children in a loving and happy home. And he delighted in the joy brought on by his 9 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren that he got to meet. My father always taught us to keep your head up despite the difficulties, keep moving forward. You are stronger than you realize. I hold on to the lessons of my father's survival and hope his strength and determination inspire you too to keep your head up. In loving memory of my father, Mark Avram Mordechai Simlitz. on his website.
Esther, that was a beautiful, very moving story of success, and thank you for coming. Where did you live? Yeah, she came in from Long Island with a filming crew, and hopefully she'll go on to many other synagogues yearly, telling this beautiful story. Thank you, Esther. Now I'm going to welcome Lisa and Fran so that we can begin.